Chapter 10 of Merton of the Movies. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Merton of the Movies by Harry Leon Wilson. Chapter 10 of Shattered Illusions. The next morning he sat a long time in the genial sunlight watching carpenters finish a scaffolding beside the pool that had once floated logs to a sawmill. The scaffolding was a stout affair supporting an immense tank that would, evidently for some occult reason important to screen art, hold a great deal of water. The sawmill was gone. At one end of the pool rode a small sailboat with one mast, its canvas flapping idly in a gentle breeze. Its deck was littered with rigging upon which two men worked. They seemed to be getting things ship-shape for a cruise. When he had tired of this, he started off toward the high-gear dance-hall. Something all day had been drawing him there against his will. He hesitated to believe it was the Montague girl's kindly manner toward him the day before, yet he could identify no other influence. Probably it was that. Yet he didn't want to face her again, even if for a moment she had quit trying to be funny, even if for a moment her eyes had searched his quite earnestly, her broad, amiable face glowing with that sudden friendly concern. It had been hard to withstand this yesterday. He had been in actual danger of confiding to her that engagements of late were not plentiful, something like that. And it would be harder today. Even the caller would make it harder to resist the confidence that he was not at this time overwhelmed with offers for his art. He had for what seemed like an interminable stretch of time been solitary and an outlaw. It was something to have been spoken to by a human being who expressed ever so fleeting an interest in his affairs, even by someone as inconsequent, as negligible in the world of screen artistry as this lightsome minx who, because of certain mental infirmities, could never hope for the least enviable eminence in a profession demanding seriousness of purpose. Still, it would be foolish to go again to the set where she was. She might think he was encouraging her. So he passed the high gear, where a 4-horse stage watched by 2 cameras was now releasing its passengers, who all appeared to be direct from New York, and walked on to an outdoor set that promised entertainment. This was the narrow street of some quaint European village, Scotch, as he soon saw from the dress of its people. A large automobile was invading this remote hamlet to the dismay of its inhabitants. Rehearsed through a megaphone, they scurried within doors at its approach, ancient men hobbling on sticks, and frantic mothers grabbing their little ones from the path of the monster. 2 trial trips he saw the car make the length of the little street. At its lower end, brooding placidly, was an ancient horse rather recalling Dexter in his generously exposed bones and the jaded droop of his head above a low stone wall. Twice the car sped by him, arousing no sign of apprehension nor even of interest. He paid it not so much as the tribute of a raised eyelid. The car went back to the head of the street where its entrance would be made. "All right, ready," came the megaphoned order. Again the peaceful street was thrown into panic by this snorting dragon from the outer world. The old men hobbled affrightedly within doors, the mothers saved their children. And this time, to the stupefaction of Merton Gill, even the old horse proved to be an actor of rare merits. As the car approached, he seemed to suffer a painful shock. He tossed his aged head, kicked viciously with his rear feet, stood absurdly aloft on them, then turned and fled from the monster. As Merton mused upon the genius of the trainer who had taught his horse not only to betray fright at a motor car, but to distinguish between rehearsals and the actual taking of a scene, he observed a man who emerged from a clump of nearby shrubbery. He carried a shotgun. This was broken at the breech, and the man was blowing smoke from the barrels as he came on. So that was it. The panic of the old horse had been but a simple reaction to a couple of charges of, perhaps, rock salt. Merton hoped it had been nothing sterner. For the first time in his screen career, he became cynical about his art. A thing of shame, of machinery, of subterfuge. Nothing would be real, perhaps not even the art. It is probable that lack of food conduced to this disparaging outlook, and he recovered presently, for he had been smitten with a quick vision of Beulah Baxter in one of her most daring exploits. She at least was real. Deaf to entreaty, she honestly braved her hazards. It was a comforting thought after this late exposure of a sham. In this slightly combative mood he retraced his steps and found himself outside the high-gear dance-hall, fortified for another possible encounter with the inquiring and obviously sympathetic Montague girl. He entered and saw that she was not on the set. The bar-room dance-hall was for the moment deserted of its ribald crew, while an honest inhabitant of the open spaces on a balcony was holding a large revolver to the shrinking back of one of the New York men who had lately arrived by the stage. He forced this man, who was plainly not honest, to descend the stairs and to sign at a table a certain paper. Then, with weapon still in hand, the honest Westerner forced the cowardly New Yorker in the direction of the front door until they passed out of the picture. On this, the board director of the day before called loudly, "Now, boys, in your places. You've heard a shot. You're running outside to see what's the matter. On your toes now. Try it once." From rear doors came the motley frequenters of the place, led by the elder Montague. They trooped to the front in two lines and passed from the picture. Here they milled about, waiting for further orders. "Rotten," called the director. "Rotten and then some. Listen, you came like a lot of children marching out of a public school. Don't come in lines. Break it up. Push each other. Fight to get ahead, and you're noisy, too. You're shouting. You're saying, 'What's this? What's it all about? What's the matter? Which way did he go?' Say anything you want to, but keep shouting. Anything at all. Say, 'There's gold in them hills,' if you can't think of anything else. Go on now, boys. Do it again and pep it, see? Turn the juice on. Open up the old mufflers." The men went back through the rear doors. The late caller would here have left, being fed up with this sort of stuff, but at that moment he descried the Montague girl back behind a light standard. She had not noted him, but was in close talk with a man he recognized as Jeff Baird, arch perpetrator of the infamous Buckeye comedies. They came toward him, still talking as he looked. "We'll finish here tomorrow afternoon, anyway," the girl was saying. "Fine," said Baird. "That makes everything jake. Get over on the set whenever you're through. Come over tonight if they don't shoot here, just to give us a look in." "Can't," said the girl. "Soon as I get out of this dump, I gotta eat on the lot and everything, and be over to Baxter's layout. She'll be doing tank stuff till all hours. Shipwreck and murder and all like that. Gosh, I hope it ain't cold. I don't mind the water, but I certainly hate to get out and wait in wet clothes while Sig Rosenblatt is thinking about a retake." "Well," Baird turned to go, "take care of yourself. Don't dive and forget to come up. Come over when you're ready." "Sure. So long." Here the girl, turning from Baird, noted Merton Gill beside her. "Well, well, as I live, the acting kid once more. Say, you're getting to be a regular studio hound, ain't you?" For the moment he had forgotten his troubles. He was burning to ask her if Beulah Baxter would really work in a shipwreck scene that night at the place where he had watched the carpenters and the men on the sailboat, But as he tried to word this, he saw that the girl was again scanning him with keen eyes. He knew she would read the collar, the beard, perhaps even a look of mere hunger that he thought must now be showing. "Say, see here, Trooper, what's the shooting all about anyway? You up against it?" "Yes." There was again in her eye the look of warm concern, and she was no longer trying to be funny. He might now have admitted a few little things about his screen career, but again the director interrupted. "Miss Montague, where are you? Oh, well, remember, you're behind the piano during that gunplay just now, and you stay hid till after the boys get out. We'll shoot this time, so get set." She sped off with a last backward glance of questioning. He waited but a moment before leaving. He was almost forgetting his hunger in the pretty certain knowledge that in a few hours he would actually behold his Wonder Woman in at least one of her daring exploits. Shipwreck. Perhaps she would be all but drowned. He hastened back to the pool that had now acquired this high significance. The carpenters were still puttering about on the scaffold. He saw that platforms for the cameras had been built out from its side. He noted, too, and was puzzled by an aeroplane propeller that had been stationed close to one corner of the pool, just beyond the stern of the little sailing craft. Perhaps there would be an airplane wreck in addition to the shipwreck. Now he had something besides food to think of. And he wondered what the Montague girl could be doing in the company of a really serious artist like Beulah Baxter. From her own story she was going to get wet, but from what he knew of her she would be some character not greatly missed from the cast if she should, as Bear had suggested, dive and forget to come up. He supposed that Baird had meant this to be humorous, the humor typical of a man who could profane a great art with the atrocious Buckeye comedies, so called. He put in the hours until nightfall in aimless wandering and idle gazing, and was early at the poolside where his heroine would do her sensational acting. It was now a scene of thrilling activity. Immense lights, both from the scaffolding and from a tower back of the sailing craft, flooded its deck and rigging from time to time as adjustments were made. The rigging was slack and the deck was still littered, intentionally so, he now perceived. The gallant little boat had been cruelly buffeted by a gale. Two sailors in piratical dress could be seen to emerge at intervals from the cabin. Suddenly the gale was on with terrific force. The sea rose in great waves, and the tiny ship rocked in a perilous manner. Great billows of water swept its decks. Merton Gill stared in amazement at these phenomena so dissonant with the quiet starlit night. Then he traced them without difficulty to their various sources. The gale issued from the swift revolutions of that aeroplane propeller he had noticed a while ago. The flooding billows were spilled from the big tank at the top of the scaffold, and the boat rocked in obedience to the tugging of a rope, tugged from the shore by a crew of helpers, that ran to the top of its mast. Thus had the storm been produced. A spidery youngish man from one of the platforms built out from the scaffold now became sharply vocal through a megaphone to assistants who were bending the elements to the need of this particular hazard of Hortense. He called directions to the men who tugged the rope, to the men in control of the lights, and to another who seemed to create the billows. Among other items he wished more action for the boat and more water for the billows. "See that your tank gets full up this time," he called, whereupon an engine under the scaffold, by means of a large rubber hose reaching into the pool, began to suck water into the tank above. The speaker must be Miss Baxter's director, the enviable personage who saw her safely through her perils. When one of the turning reflectors illumined him, Merton saw his face of a keen Semitic type. He seemed to possess not the most engaging personality. His manner was aggressive. He spoke rudely to his doubtless conscientious employees. He danced in little rages of temper, and altogether he was not one with whom the watcher would have cared to come in contact. He wondered, indeed, that so puissant a star as Beulah Baxter should not be able to choose her own director, for surely the presence of this unlovely, waspishly tempered being could be nothing but an irritant in the daily life of the Wonder Woman. Perhaps she had tolerated him merely for one picture. Perhaps he was especially good in shipwrecks. If Merton Gill were in this company, he would surely have words with this person, director or no director. He hastily wrote a one-reel scenario in which the man so far forgot himself as to speak sharply to the star, and in which a certain young actor, a new member of the company, resented the ungentlemanly words by pitching the offender into a convenient pool, and earned even more than gratitude from the starry-eyed Wonder Woman. The objectionable man continued active, profuse of gesture, and loud through the megaphone. Once more the storm. The boat rocked threateningly, the wind roared through its slack rigging, and giant billows swept the frail craft. Light, as from a half-clouded moon, broke through the mist that issued from a steam pipe. There was another lull, and the Semitic type on the platform became increasingly offensive. Merton saw himself saying, "Allow me, Miss Baxter, to relieve you of the presence of this bounder." The man was impossible. Constantly he had searched the scene for his heroine. She would probably not appear until they were ready to shoot, and this seemed not to be at once if the rising temper of the director could be thought an indication. The big hose again drew water from the pool to the tank, whence, at a sudden release, it would issue in billows. The big lights at last seemed to be adjusted to the director's whim. The aeroplane propeller whirred, and the gale was found acceptable. The men at the rope tugged the boat into grave danger. The moon lighted the mist that overhung the scene. Then, at last, Merton started, peering eagerly forward across the length of the pool. At the far end, half illumined by the big lights, stood the familiar figure of his Wonder Woman, the slim little girl with the wistful eyes. Plainly he could see her now as the mist lifted. She was chatting with one of the pirates who had stepped ashore from the boat. The wonderful golden hair shone resplendent under the glancing rays of the arcs. A cloak was about her shoulders, but at a word of command from the director, she threw it off and stepped to the boat's deck. She was dressed in a short skirt, her trim feet and ankles lightly shod and silken clad. The sole maritime touch in her garb was a figured kerchief at her throat, similar to those worn by the piratical crew. "All ready, Hortense! All ready, Jose and Gaston! Get your places!" Miss Baxter acknowledged the command with that characteristic little wave of a hand that he recalled from so many of her pictures, a half-humorous, half-mocking little defiance. She used it often when escaping her pursuers, as if to say that she would see them in the next installment. The star and the two men were now in the cabin, hidden from view. Merton Gill was no seaman, but it occurred to him that at least one of the crew would be at the wheel in this emergency. Probably the director knew no better. Indeed, the boat, so far as could be discerned, had no wheel. Apparently, when a storm came up, all hands went down into the cabin to get away from it. The storm did come up at this moment, with no one on deck. It struck with the full force of a tropic hurricane. The boat rocked, the wind blew, and billows swept the deck. At the height of the tempest, Beulah Baxter sprang from the cabin to the deck, clutching wildly at a stanchion. Buffeted by the billows, she groped a painful way along the side, at risk of being swept off to her death. She was followed by one of the crew who held a murderous knife in his hand, then by the other sailor who also held a knife. They, too, were swept by the billows, but seemed grimly determined upon the death of the heroine. Then, when she reached midships, and the foremost fiend was almost upon her, the mightiest of all the billows descended and swept her off into the cruel waters. Her pursuers, saving themselves only by great effort, held to the rigging and stared after the girl. They leaned far over the ship's rocking side, and each looked from under a spread hand. For a distressing interval the heroine battled with the waves, but her frail strength availed her little. She raised a despairing face for an instant to the camera, and its agony was illumined. Then the dread waters closed above her. The director's whistle blew, the waves were stilled, the tumult ceased. The head of Beulah Baxter appeared halfway down the tank. She was swimming toward the end where Merton stood. He had been thrilled beyond words at this actual sight of his heroine in action, but now it seemed that a new emotion might overcome him. He felt faint. Beulah Baxter would issue from the pool, there at his feet. He might speak to her, might even help her to climb out. At least no one else had appeared to do this. Seemingly, no one now cared where Miss Baxter swam to, or whether she were offered any assistance in landing. She swam with an admirable crawl stroke, reached the wall, and put up a hand to it. He stepped forward, but she was out before he reached her side. His awe had delayed him. He drew back then, for the Star, after vigorously shaking herself, went to a tall brazier in which glowed a charcoal fire. Here he now noticed for the first time the prop boy Jimmy, who had almost certainly defaulted with an excellent razor. Jimmy threw a blanket about the Star's shoulders as she hovered above the glowing coals. Merton had waited for her voice. He might still venture to speak to her, to tell her of his long and profound admiration for her art. Her voice came as she shivered over the fire. "Murder, that water's cold! Rosenblatt swore he'd have it warmed, but I'm here to say it wouldn't boil an egg in 4 minutes." He could not at first identify this voice with the remembered tones of Beulah Baxter, but of course she was now hoarse with the cold. Under the circumstances he could hardly expect his heroine's own musical clearness. Then, as the girl spoke again, something stirred among his more recent memories. The voice was still hoarse, but he placed it now. He approached the brazier. It was undoubtedly the Montague girl. She recognized him, even as she squeezed water from the hair of wondrous gold. "Hello again, kid. You're everywhere, ain't you? Say, what'd you think of that Rosenblatt man? Swore he'd put the steam into that water and take off the chill, and he never." She threw aside the blanket and squeezed water from her garments, then began to slap her legs, arm, and chest. "Well, I'm getting a gentle glow anyhow. What did you think of the scene?" "It was good, very well done indeed." He hoped it didn't sound patronizing, though that was how he felt. He believed now that Miss Baxter would have done it much better. He ventured a question. "But how about Miss Baxter? When does she do something? Is she going to be swept off the boat too?" "Baxter? Into that water? Quit your kidding." "But isn't she here at all? Won't she do anything here?" "Listen here, kid. Why should she loaf around on the set when she's paying me good money to double for her?" "You double for Beulah Baxter?" It was some more of the girl's nonsense, and a blasphemy for which he could not easily forgive her. "Why not? Ain't I a good stunt actress? I'll tell the lot she hasn't found anyone yet that can get away with her stuff better than what I do." "But I heard her say herself she never allowed anyone to double for her. She wouldn't do such a thing." Here sounded a scornful laugh from Jimmy the prop boy. "Bunk," said he at the laugh's end. "How long you been doubling for her, Miss Montague? 2 years, ain't it? I know it was before I come here, and I been on the lot a year and a half. Say, he ought to see some of the stuff you done for her out on location, like jumping into the locomotive engine from your auto and catching the brake beams when the train's moving and going across that quarry on the cable and riding down that lumber flume 60 miles per hour and riding some of them outlaw buck jumpers. He ought to seen some of that stuff, hey, Miss Montague? That's right, Jimmy. You tell 'em all about me. I hate to talk of myself. Very wonderfully, Merton Gill divined that this was said with a humorous intention. Jimmy was less sensitive to values. He began to obey. Well, I don't know. There's that motorcycle stuff. Pretty good, I'll say. I wouldn't try that, no sir, not for a cool $1,000,000. And that chase stuff on the roofs downtown where you jumped across that court that wasn't any too darned narrow. And say, I wished I could skin up a tree the way you can. And then there was that time. All right, Jimmy. I can tell 'em the rest sometime. I don't really hate to talk about myself. That's on the level. And say, listen here, Jimmy. You're my favorite sweetheart, ain't you? Yes, ma'am, assented Jimmy warmly. All right, beat it up and get me about 2 quarts of that hot coffee and about 4 ham sandwiches, 2 for you and 2 for me. That's a good kid. Sure, exclaimed Jimmy and was off. Merton Gill had been dazed by these revelations, by the swift and utter destruction of his loftiest ideal. He hardly cared to know now if Beulah Baxter were married. It was the Montague girl who had most thrilled him for 2 years. Yet, almost as if from habit, he heard himself asking, Do you happen to know if Beulah Baxter is married? Baxter married? Sure. I should think you'd know it from the way that Sig Rosenblatt bawls everybody out. Who's he? Who is he? Why, he's her husband, of course. He's Mr. Beulah Baxter. That little director up on the platform that yells so? This unspeakable person to be actually the husband of the Wonder Woman? The man he had supposed she must find intolerable even as a director. It was unthinkable, more horrible, somehow, than her employment of a double. In time he might have forgiven that, but this! Sure, that's her honest-to-God husband, and he's the best one out of the 3 that I know she's had. Sig's a good scout even if he don't look like Buffalo Bill. In fact, he's all right in spite of his rough ways. He'd go further for you than most of the men on this lot. If I wanted a favor, I'd go to Sig before a lot of Christians I happen to know. And he's a bully director if he is noisy. Baxter's crazy about him, too. Don't make any mistake there. I won't, he answered, not knowing what she said. She shot him a new look. Say, kid, as long as we're talking, you seem kind of up against it. Where's your overcoat a night like this? And when did you last— Miss Montague! Miss Montague! The director was calling. Excuse me, she said. I gotta go entertain the white folks again. She tucked up the folds of her blanket and sped around the pool to disappear in the mazes of the scaffolding. He remained a moment staring dully into the now quiet water. Then he walked swiftly away. Beulah Baxter, his Wonder Woman, had deceived her public in Peoria, Illinois, by word of mouth. She employed a double at critical junctures. She'd be a fool not to, the Montague girl had said. And in private life, having been unhappily wed twice before, she was Mrs. Sigmund Rosenblatt, and crazy about her husband. A little while ago he had felt glad he was not to die of starvation before seeing his Wonder Woman. Reeling under the first shock of his discoveries, he was now sorry. Beulah Baxter was no longer his Wonder Woman. She was Mr. Rosenblatt's. He would have preferred death, he thought, before this heart-withering revelation. End of chapter 10.